Story 1. One of my best friends from grade school moved away. He wrote his phone number down on a piece of paper so we could keep in touch. But I lost it. I never spoke to him again because I had no way to contact him. Story 2. It may sound strange, but not having cell phones meant that if you planned to meet someone somewhere and they were late, you had no idea if they were just around the corner, going to be an hour late, or at the wrong place. You had to stand there, staring into space, because you didn't have anything to scroll through while you waited. Story 3. I never heard the words anxiety, depression, or coping strategies. Everyone in my family was drinking away their feelings and denying that those feelings existed. Story 4. The 1990s were not a perfect time when nothing bad ever happened. The point was that things seemed like they could improve in the future. The 1990s were significant because of the hope in the air, not because there were no problems. There were still issues like racism, sexism, homophobia, murder, rape, and corruption. Problems we still face today. However, unlike today, during the 1990s, barriers were coming down everywhere. Apartheid ended in South Africa, the Berlin Wall was dismantled, and the Cold War concluded. A massive riot in Los Angeles compelled not only the country but the world to confront how black individuals were treated by the police. The internet emerged, video game consoles were released continuously, and technology advanced rapidly. There was immense hope for the future wherever you looked. So what happened? The events of September 11th? The rise of social media and sensationalized content? There isn't one definitive answer. However, one thing is certain. The changes we expected for the better did not materialize. In fact, conditions may have worsened. Story 5. The neighborhood was much more dangerous. Gangs were engaging in turf wars over trivial matters. Police could easily frame anyone they chose because there were no cell phones to record them, and juries consistently believed the officer over any alleged criminal. Story 6. Being a child diagnosed with autism in the 1990s, I was placed in special education classes even though I didn't need them. It was frustrating. I felt bored and embarrassed. At that time, autistic people were often perceived as slow. Story 7. If you were gay, life was significantly more challenging outside a few neighborhoods in large cities. Even in those areas, the threat of AIDS was always present for you and most of the people you knew. Story 8. Heroin chic, characterized by obsessive diet culture and rampant eating disorders, did not start in the 1990s, but it was so prevalent and normalized that it was truly concerning. Story 9. 1994. The Rwandan Genocide. 1995. The Bosnian Genocide. 1998. The Kosovo ethnic cleansing. The world is a large place. Story 10. You could be bullied in school, and the person responsible received only a 3-day suspension, even though they broke your arm. Story 11. If your family lived in a rural area and wasn't wealthy enough to buy a computer, you could feel lonely in a way that people cannot comprehend now. I spent the last 2 years of high school doing nothing, watching television, and playing some 16-bit role-playing games repeatedly because I couldn't get anywhere or do anything. I understand that it may sound relaxing nowadays, but back then, it could be very depressing. You knew very well that the kids who had cars were out going to concerts and coffee houses while you were home alone doing nothing. Could be maddening. Story 12. Watch the Woodstock 1999 documentary on Netflix. It captured everything negative about the 1990s in a concentrated form. Story 13. Mental health was not well understood by the public, and we did not have a good grasp of what depression was. Additionally, consider any movie from the 1990s or 2000s. A woman was considered fat if she weighed over 110 pounds, and it felt as if she no longer existed in society due to the impact on her social standing. Story 14. Ask anyone from Eastern Europe, especially post-Soviet Union countries, about this. There was nothing good at all in the 1990s. Story 15. I watched as all our customers moved to Mexico or found subcontractors there. It marked the decline of American manufacturing. Additionally, my father passed away when I was 28 years old. He was only 59. Story 16. The most powerful man in the world told us that oral sex wasn't really sex. His mistress also became the villain of the story, despite the fact she was a naive 22-year-old, and he was a 49-year-old married man. Clinton's actions in that era actually redefined how people thought about sex. Additionally, people also disliked his wife as a result of the story, despite the fact she was the one who was cheated on. But Teflon Bill? His approval ratings actually went up. Story 17, being bored. For every story of how we ran around the neighborhood or played in the woods until dark creating our own adventures, there's another story about how we lay in bed staring at the ceiling with nothing to do for hours. Story 18. Everyone loves the music from the 1990s, but it can be quite bleak. Most of the grunge bands sang about addiction and severe depression, struggling to cope, and I believe much of it influenced mainstream society. The alternative music scene was filled with gut-wrenching lyrics. I was in high school and college at the time, and I cannot go back and listen to bands like Alice in Chains, Mad Season, Nirvana, and Pearl Jam anymore. Back then, I listened to them constantly and loved the music, but in hindsight, I think it had a negative effect on my psyche. Thank goodness I found the Grateful Dead when I did. Story 19. The early 1990s were quite difficult. The economy was struggling and the first Gulf War occurred. This is why George H.W. Bush lost re-election. When asked about Bush's defeat, James Carville famously said, "It's the economy." Story 20. From the late 1980s to the early 1990s, times were rough. It was violent, with crime being prevalent. Drive-by shootings and gang activity were common. The grunge culture added to the overall sense of depression. However, towards the mid to late 1990s, things began to change and improve significantly. Story 21. Crack cocaine was prevalent in the early 1990s, while gun violence surged in many major cities in the United States during the late 1990s. Pollution levels were alarming, and teenage pregnancy rates were high. HIV remained a significant concern during this time. Story 22. The 1990s in Russia are still regarded as the worst time in recent years. A sudden switch to capitalism allowed frauds and scammers of all kinds to be not just one, but several steps ahead of both the government and the people. In fact, the government itself was among the top 3 scammers. Crime and corruption were also rampant. Your job could be gone one day. Your business, if you started it, could be gone the next day. The bank you trusted could be gone the day after. And then you could be gone simply because you looked at someone the wrong way or had the audacity to take your concerns to the police. Story 23. There was significant anti-LGBTQ discrimination. Incidents of violence were so frequent that you couldn't go a week without hearing about another case. When discussing these incidents with non-LGBTQ individuals, many found it hard to believe the extent of the violence. Companies were still terminating employees upon discovering their sexual orientation. There was no recognized marital status for LGBTQ couples, meaning if a partner died without a will, the surviving partner had no legal claim to belongings. Crime shows often made jokes about homicide related to LGBTQ individuals. Many cases of sexual assault against LGBTQ individuals were never investigated. LGBTQ individuals were frequently portrayed as the punchline in shows. HIV and AIDS remained widespread in large communities until the late 1990s. The alt-right was actively rising, which coincided with an increase in school shootings that would become a significant trend in America. Purdue Pharma successfully brought OxyContin to market with FDA approval and initiated a marketing campaign that fueled the opioid epidemic. The Clintons positioned neoliberalism as the platform of the Democratic Party. There is so much more that I can't recall at 1 a.m. Story 24. Calling people's homes and awkwardly listening to their voicemail can be frustrating. It is difficult not being able to reach someone when you need to. Story 25. In Australia, we were always 6 months behind United States television and movies. Cinema movies would sometimes take 2 to 3 years to be aired on television. Song lyrics were difficult to find. Story 26. I had to use actual paper maps even after MapQuest came out. I still kept my city guidebook just in case. Story 27. Crime rates in the early 1990s were among the worst in history. Wars, genocides, and poverty were as bad or worse. Acquired immunodeficiency syndrome was a significant concern, and anti-gay bias was even worse. Women were treated more unequally than they are now. To view the 1990s as some sort of utopia requires you to be either a child of that decade, with nostalgia clouding your view, or to belong to a very distinct demographic slice of society that is overrepresented online. I am also a member of this group, but I try to have empathy for people who are not exactly like me. That said, we were not on the brink of sliding directly into fascism, which was a positive aspect. Story 28. Pollution was quite severe. Los Angeles's worst day today would have seemed sparkling in comparison. The waterways were not in good condition either, with many closed beaches and lakefronts due to toxicity. If you were even slightly different, whether you identified as queer, neurodivergent, or were part of a subculture such as goth, punk, or pagan, unless you lived in a very accepting community, you were likely to suffer. Talk therapy was generally reserved for those who were completely dysfunctional or traumatized. Otherwise, you were expected to tough it out. There was minimal acknowledgement of domestic violence and the struggles many women faced. The O.J. Simpson trial was a significant moment, comparable to the Me Too movement in cultural impact, as many women began to come forward about being abused by their partners. The same applied to issues of rape and sexual assault, which were largely downplayed and ignored. Crime rates peaked in 1992, although we did not realize at the time that they would begin to decline. Law enforcement was often perceived as out of control in their response. The unique aspect of the Rodney King beating was that it was recorded on a new video camera, allowing proof of police brutality that had been widely suspected but not documented. Divorce rates were high, which in itself isn't necessarily negative, but the family courts had not yet adapted. It was essential that a father genuinely cared for his child, as it was relatively easy to evade child support obligations, especially when moving to another state. Drunk driving did not carry the same stigma it does today. A lengthy campaign by mothers against drunk driving, who had lost children to such incidents, was necessary to change public perception about the dangers of drunk driving. Television shows during that time were often quite simplistic. Seasons typically consisted of 22 episodes and frequently included unnecessary filler. Missing an episode was not an option, as there were no means to catch up, leaving you out of lunchtime discussions the following day. A few notable shows, such as The Sopranos, were credited with transforming television, while Babylon 5 had already achieved similar recognition. Overall, television content was largely uninspired. Story 29. The 1990s in America were great if you were white, middle class, and straight. If you fell into any other category, the 1990s were similar to any other decade before and since. Story 30. The breakup of Yugoslavia resulted in war, sanctions, hyperinflation, and poverty, followed by another war and bombing. It was not the best decade for us here. Story 31. You had to potentially rewind any new movies that came out because someone forgot to do it. If you don't understand this, look up VCR and Blockbuster. Story 32. As I scroll through the comments, I think, the 90s had a lot of bad stuff, but it does not compare to now. Story 33. People often romanticize the era they grew up in. For me, it was the 1980s. I was a young adult in the 1990s, and it was no different. In a couple of years, people will be reminiscing about the 2000s and 2010s as a great time. In 30 years, they may wish it was 2025. I can already imagine them saying, "We were tough because we had to deal with COVID-19 and political challenges, but we were great." Story 34. Newt Gingrich. The political chaos of today has its roots in the decline of the willingness to reach compromises with political opponents that began with Newt Gingrich. Story 35. Restaurants, good luck finding any of the ethnic cuisine we take for granted today. Story 36. Homophobia and sexist culture were prevalent, as highlighted in the Woodstock '99 documentary. Heroin use was rampant in Europe. The world is vast, and many violent conflicts were occurring. While the present circumstances seem dire, we should not romanticize the past. Story 37. There was significant bullying, racism, and bigotry. If the local Walmart didn't have it, you never knew it existed. Everything still smelled like ashtrays because smoking indoors was allowed everywhere. Story 38. Just missing the channel you wanted on the TV guide, and you had to wait for it to come around again. Story 39. Paying $15 to $20 for one CD is quite a lot. I don't know how much that is in today's money, but it felt excessive. I was exploring file sharing as soon as I got my first computer and never felt guilty about it. Story 40. The 1990s were more dangerous than today. The most violent times in both New York City and Chicago's histories occurred in the late 1980s to mid-1990s, while their record low crime years are in the 2020s. The effects of the Reagan era were still present, and AIDS remained a significant issue. The first major decline of the American middle class happened, and Republicans began testing defiance tactics that would later affect the Obama and Biden administrations. The first mass terrorist attacks and school shootings occurred during this time. Story 41. If you got lost while driving, it was frustrating. You either had to use a map if you had one, drive around until you found your way, or stop to ask for directions. Story 42. The pressure to have sex, man, it was rough, but I wouldn't trade that decade for anything. Story 43. In school, good teachers encouraged students to treat intellectually disabled children with respect. The bad ones allowed or even encouraged bullying. There was little understanding that learning differences like dyslexia and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder are not the same as Down syndrome. That is why people did not hear about these labels until very recently. If you could get by without a diagnosis and desired a normal childhood, you did not seek it. If you needed a diagnosis but could mask it from classmates, you did. The 1990s were much more sexist than people remember. If there was a female character in an action film, there was typically a scene where the male characters objectified her. They often made fun of her throughout the movie, usually to her face unless she was intimidating, in which case they would mock her behind her back. She rarely contributed to advancing the plot. Note that I mentioned a female character. Typically, there was only one female main character per action film in the 1990s, and by main, I mean a significant supporting character. Many people did not know how to care for small animals, leading to a common misconception among older generations that guinea pigs and parakeets have a lifespan of 3 years. On average, parakeets live 7 to 15 years, and guinea pigs live 6 to 8 years. White people often believed racism was over, yet exhibited racism in strange ways. I distinctly remember in the second grade, my predominantly white school taught us about Martin Luther King Jr. Day by distributing a list of racial slurs for black people, explaining each term and discussing the misconceptions that led white people to use those terms. Only after that did they state that it was wrong without explaining why. I got in trouble for mispronouncing a slur and for expressing frustration at the teacher for refusing to assist me. Smoking was much more prevalent. Blood transfusions were sometimes not available due to the limited knowledge about human immunodeficiency virus. My mother almost died giving birth to me because she lost a significant amount of blood, and the doctors were hesitant to risk transmitting the virus to a new mother. The quality of available treatments for health issues was significantly lower than it is today. If you received chemotherapy, you went bald. Cold caps and gentler forms of chemotherapy were not widely available. Cars were not as safe. A notable percentage of teachers began their careers when it was legal to physically discipline students. Some were still resentful that the law had changed. Story 44. Early 1990s. The most violent era in modern history, the murder rate was at a peak then and didn't start coming down until around 1995. The crack cocaine epidemic was at its peak during this time as well. Politics started getting quite contentious, mainly driven by Newt Gingrich's contract with America and later in the decade, the Ken Starr investigations including the Clinton and Lewinsky scandal. Late 1990s. With some exceptions, everything felt somewhat bland culturally, continuing into the early 2000s. Maroon 5, Sarah McLachlan, Vanessa Carlton, Michelle Branch, Counting Crows, and others felt uninspiring. Later seasons of Seinfeld were unexciting, along with that disappointing movie featuring Madonna and Rupert Everett. Story 45. Dial-up. Other than that, anything that was problematic in the past is even more problematic now, plus there are many more significant issues these days. Story 46. The 1990s were truly awesome. Nothing bad ever happened. We had the best music, the best fashion, and the best television. Things were mostly analog, And the internet had not yet turbocharged our existence, so we had time to think. I really do miss the 1990s. Story 47. You needed to use the family phone to contact some people, since not everyone had constant access to the internet. Most people had dial-up connections, which meant that unless they had a second phone line, there was a choice between using the internet or the house phone. On the flip side, it was fun chatting on Messenger late at night with those who had access, just like me. Story 48. The jurors in the O.J. Simpson trial found him not guilty, partly because they wanted to achieve a victory in response to the Rodney King incident, which had no relevance to the case. They allowed a murderer to go free after two innocent people lost their lives for reasons unrelated to the trial. This was acknowledged years later. Story 49. It depends on the country. In Russia, the economy collapsed and people lost all their savings. My kindergarten teacher was an alcoholic. The cook at the kindergarten did not wash the vegetables properly, which resulted in several children contracting a fever similar to scarlet fever. My liver was twice the normal size, and I was unconscious for about a day. No one sued the kindergarten because they did not yet understand how to navigate the court system. There were many other strange occurrences. Story 50. Extremism started in the 1990s. It was not like political extremism, but everything had to be extravagant. Flavors, colors, toys, video games, cars, bikes. Anything you can think of. This excess is detrimental to us. Story 51. In Ireland, they were still imprisoning women for becoming pregnant outside of marriage. Story 52. Violent crime was much higher, particularly in the early 1990s. Watching Menace to Society can provide a sense of it. Story 53. When cell phones became popular, which was likely in the late 1990s or early 2000s, the only way to search for information was to send a text message with the word Google. It sometimes worked. Additionally, there were charges for text messages. I remember a few girls I dated had cell phone bills of $200 for exceeding their text limits. Story 54. 1. The LGBTQ community was not accepted nearly as well. Transgender individuals were ridiculed and seen as having a mental disorder. The don't ask, don't tell policy was considered progressive at the time. We have truly come a long way. I don't know about you, but I'm happy that thongs have replaced granny panties. Cisco is a national hero and should win the Medal of Honor. As much as there are things I dislike about modern cars, there is no doubt that the interior and driving experience have improved. If you look at the interior of a Lexus from the 1990s, you might laugh at how quaint it seems. Now, consider the interior of a base model Oldsmobile. They may have been more reliable, but they were dull cars to drive. Televisions. Having a gigantic screen in your living room was something we all dreamed about. Now you can get a 65-inch TV for under $400. The first big screens were comically sized tube televisions, and they would take up your entire living room. Story 55. My children played outside from the time they got out of school until the streetlights came on. I never got to see them. Today, my grandchildren and great-grandchildren stay inside and play video games with their friends on my television. I cannot watch my own television when they come over. Story 56. I was raised in a United Auto Workers home in the suburbs of Detroit. The early 1990s carried over the pessimism of the late 1980s in terms of labor. The North American Free Trade Agreement was seen as a threat to manufacturing jobs. My dad's plant ended up closing, resulting in many job losses. Japanese companies were outperforming American ones. Their cars were better and more affordable. Their electronics were of high quality, and their efficient corporate culture was idolized in movies like Die Hard and Rising Sunday. Story 57. Casual homophobia, fat shaming, and general meanness. Watch a movie from the 1990s or 2000s and be prepared for the cringe. Story 58. Remembering all your friends' phone numbers and speaking to their parents while waiting for them to come to the phone. Smoking in pubs before the ban. Limited access to alternative non-pop music. If the shops didn't stock it, you had to be a detective to find it. Waiting for people to finish using the phone before going online. Story 59. The way we treated female celebrities or women who were infamous. such as Monica Lewinsky or Princess Diana. Story 60. Not being able to fast forward, rewind, or pause television is frustrating. If you missed something, that was it. It was gone. Story 61. The brutal murder of Matthew Shepard was an eye-opener to the cruelty of the world for my middle school self. Story 62. The era of unhealthy food is filled with dyes, sugar, preservatives, and artificial ingredients, packaged and microwaved in plastic for convenience. Additionally, the nutritional guidance provided was so poor that it initiated an obesity epidemic we are only beginning to address now, 30 years later, through innovative medications. Story 63. Heroin chic relates to how dangerously thin supermodels and some celebrities such as Angelina Jolie were. As a young girl, this had a significant impact on me and many other girls like me. Story 64. Usually, people who say the 1990s were so good are typically white, straight, and cisgender. I am a white, straight, cisgender man. The 1990s were great for me. Story 65. Employment. The recession in the early part of the decade made finding a decent job very difficult. Story 66. It's challenging to have your sexual awakening when you're afraid that every encounter could expose you to a virus that could be fatal. Story 67. A little too serious, perhaps, but millions died from famine in North Korea. The horrific conflicts in the Balkans resulted in entire cemeteries in Bosnia filled with victims from 1994. The Rwandan massacre is another tragic event. Additionally, life expectancy, GDP per capita, literacy rates, and child mortality rates were worse globally than they are today. On a side note, the internet was not very good. Story 68. I was 16 in 1990. I drove a hot rod with a raised rear end, wide tires, loud glass pack exhaust, and a bright paint job that you could see and hear from miles away. I would blast music from bands like Motley Crue, Metallica, and AC/DC. The car was perfectly legal in every sense for the county I lived in. Police did not have body cameras, and not everyone had cameras in their pockets, and they knew it. If you ever watched The Simpsons and know the character Snake, that's what I looked like to them. They could get away with almost anything, and it would be your word against theirs every single time. I cannot tell you how many times I was pulled over, put in handcuffs, and detained in the back of a squad car while my car was searched for drugs, weapons, or alcohol. They never found anything, and I was never charged or arrested, but that never stopped the same officers from pulling me over and searching my car the next week. These days, as an older man, I support law enforcement, but there was a time when they could get away with almost anything, and there was no recourse. Story 69. The Gulf War. Early 1990s recession. 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Satanic Panic. Waco, Oklahoma City bombing. Rwandan genocide. Los Angeles race riots. Bosnian War. Columbine. Woodstock 1999. 1995 Chicago heat wave. Crime rate. Teen pregnancy rate. Prevalent homophobia. Increased peer pressure among teenagers to engage in sexual activity. Story 70. It was highly homophobic, and being a violent misogynist was considered cool. Making fun of transgender women was not seen as a bad thing either. O.J. Simpson got away with murder. Rodney King was brutally beaten, and the police were reprimanded in a public trial. Story 71. If you were Russian, everything would be collapsing around you with no rule of law and chaos for years. In the Balkans, there is war, and ethnic cleansing. In Central Africa, it is the same. Western Europeans and Americans had it easy, with an ironic perspective on everything and the so-called end of history, where democracy and classical liberalism seemed to be the only future for the world. Story 72. Sexual assault was prevalent in the past, significantly worse than today. There were no security cameras during that time. The Me Too movement brought about substantial change. Search for Uncle Luke, Sir Mix-a-Lot, and others. Story 73. The gender and sexuality politics were not great. Have you gone back and watched My Best Friend's Wedding? It is one of the scariest movies ever made. Story 74. The death rate from AIDS remains a serious concern. Today, many view HIV as a manageable chronic illness, and there are effective preventative medications available. I vividly remember watching children close to my age on the news who were suffering from this incurable illness, having contracted it at birth before blood screening measures were implemented. It was truly horrifying. Story 75. You had to be at home to make or receive a phone call at a specific time. Otherwise, you would miss seeing your friends that day. If it was a Friday, you wouldn't see them all weekend. Story 76. You had to watch soft adult content through distorted lines on late-night television, hoping to see a glimpse of nudity because you weren't a subscriber. Story 77. You know how some people will say you can't even make a joke these days? Well, they could back then. They could say any racist, homophobic, misogynistic, or otherwise bigoted thing they wanted to, and you were supposed to dismiss it because it was a joke. Story 78. Not being able to easily organize a group or party or find a roommate indicates a lack of mass communication. We had to post flyers on lampposts around campus. Story 79. It was terrible for women and girls. The misogyny was pervasive. I highly recommend everyone read 90's Bitch by Alison Yarrow for an insightful look at women's rights in the 1990s. Story 80. Well, the Los Angeles riots and the O.J. Simpson trial come to mind. The North American Free Trade Agreement was suboptimal at best. The Rwandan genocide occurred. There were failed peace talks between Israel and Palestine. The United States government relentlessly bombed a defeated Iraq. The United States interfered in the 1996 Russian election, which is directly responsible for many issues Russia faces now. Crystal Pepsi was a notable product. The decline of rock and roll is significant. Republicans had an insane overreaction to the Lewinsky scandal. Democrats dismissed the Lewinsky scandal in an equally insane manner. The case of Casey versus Planned Parenthood was pivotal. New Kids on the Block was a popular music group. The Enron scandal was infamous. I could go on. Story 81. I remember the feeling of having only 2 or 3 CDs with me at a given time. I didn't want to listen to any of them again, but I was forced to if I wanted music. Often, those repeated listens made me love the albums even more. You don't experience this anymore in the age of streaming services. Those days are over. Story 82. It wasn't a fun time to be a woman. There was a lot of media pitting girls against each other and framing other women as competition instead of friends. There was also a lot of pressure to be very thin and to be sexualized. This behavior was socially acceptable, at least in the area where I lived. Story 83. Newt Gingrich and Strom Thurmond. School shootings are becoming normal. There was uncertainty about the location of Russia's nuclear weapons after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Story 84. The absence of an electronic map providing step-by-step directions for navigation is a significant drawback. Traditional paper maps are not sufficient for this purpose. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.